You're listening to Audiology. Support this channel by becoming a member and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. During the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1760, France and Great Britain were locked in a battle over control of the Ohio and Illinois countries, which lie south of the Great Lakes. Native tribes in the area played crucial roles, aligning with whichever imperial power they believed could best meet their needs. When the conflict ended with the 1763 Treaty of Paris, France handed this territory over to the British. However, discontent brewed among the native tribes, leading to Pontiac's War as they attempted to push the British out. In response, hoping to calm tensions, the British established the Royal Proclamation of 1763, drawing a line between colonist and native territories. By 1768, the British further negotiated the Treaty of Fort Stanwix with the Iroquois, who claimed the Ohio country, moving the boundary west and opening up more land for colonial expansion. Figures like George Washington quickly seized this opportunity, forming land companies and snatching up grants. However, the Shawnees and Cherokees, who had long used the territory for hunting and weren't consulted in the treaty, contested the Iroquois' right to the land. Efforts by the Shawnees to form a confederacy to resist the colonial encroachment were undermined by British diplomacy using the Iroquois. This isolation led to the Shawnees' defeat in Lord Dunmore's War in 1774, forcing them to accept the Ohio River as the frontier line. To tighten control over the frontier, the British Parliament enacted the Quebec Act in 1774, placing the region under Quebec's jurisdiction and annulling colonial claims. This move infuriated American colonists, further fueling their drive towards independence in 1776. Throughout the American Revolutionary War, many native tribes sided with the British, hoping to expel the settlers. Yet, the 1783 Treaty of Paris, which concluded the war, saw Britain transfer the region to the United States without addressing native rights, essentially leaving the tribes at continuing risk of losing their lands. Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, an ally to the British during the war, was shocked to discover Britain's betrayal in the treaty. In 1783, Brant spearheaded the creation of the Northwestern Confederacy to protect shared tribal lands, declaring that no land could be ceded without collective agreement. Despite efforts by the U.S. to sell off land to pay national debt, dismissing the Native Confederacy, a series of treaties forced under American terms saw some leaders relenting. Yet many, especially among the Shawnees and Lenapes, prepared for war, steadfast in their determination to defend their ancestral lands north of the Ohio River. In 1786, after a series of skirmishes along the Ohio River, Kentucky militia took a significant military step, the first since the Revolutionary War ended. Under Generals George Rogers Clark and Benjamin Logan, they embarked on an invasion into native territories. Clark led 1,200 men up the Wabash River in September, but faced with logistical nightmares, a mutiny and desertions, he had to retreat without achieving his goals. The following month, Logan took 790 men to attack Shawnee villages near the Mad River, which were mostly filled with non-combatants since the warriors were away. Logan's forces burned these villages and their stores of food, and they killed or captured many Native Americans, including Moluntha, a respected Shawnee chief who had previously signed a peace treaty. After these attacks, the Shawnee, left homeless, were welcomed by the Miami tribe to settle near their capital, Kikionga. This area soon became a hub for those most resistant to American expansion. A pivotal meeting of the Northwestern Confederacy was moved to the Detroit River's Wyandot village of Brownstown after the destruction of the Shawnee towns. At this gathering, Joseph Brant and leaders from various tribes resolved to reject the recent treaties with the U.S. as invalid, demanding a new treaty conference to reconsider their terms. In response to these escalating tensions and aiming for American settlement, the U.S. Confederation Congress created the Northwest Territory in 1787 and appointed Arthur St. Clair as its governor. St. Clair's goals were ambitious: negotiate new treaties without giving up any previously claimed land, expand American territory if possible, and weaken the Native Confederacy. In 1788, despite native preferences for a neutral negotiation site, St. Clair summoned them to Fort Harmar. When he rejected their boundary proposals, Joseph Brant and others boycotted the negotiations, resulting in a treaty that many viewed as merely reiterating disputed agreements without truly addressing the core issues. This situation further strained relations, leading to increased violence. Native forces attacked settlers and their boats on the Ohio River, prompting retaliation from American militias. One such counterattack, led by Major John Hardin, resulted in the deaths of several Shawnee individuals, escalating the conflict. As the first U.S. president, George Washington, along with Secretary of War Henry Knox, saw no other solution but a military one to secure the Northwest Territory. Despite an existing skepticism towards a permanent army, they bolstered the American military presence, setting the stage for a continued and bloody conflict over American expansion into native lands. On April 20th, 1790, the 1st American Regiment found themselves in their first aggressive move against Native Americans. This occurred when General Josiah Harmar teamed up with General Charles Scott from Kentucky to attack the Shawnee village known as Chalogatha. The following month brought a sharp response from the Native Americans who attacked settlers near a place called Limestone, now known as Maysville, Kentucky. This incident, termed Hartshorn's defeat, resulted in 5 settlers killed and another 8 missing. By the time autumn rolled around, the United States decided to take a significant step against the natives along the Maumee River. They tasked General Harmar with a punitive mission, which involved destroying Kekionga and nearby settlements, with orders to kill any natives who stood in his way. On September 30th, Harmar's force, comprised of 1,100 militiamen and 320 regular soldiers, left Fort Washington on the Ohio River. Their effort was supposed to be supported by a diversion from Major Jean-François Hamtramck from Vincennes, although that force never managed to join up with Harmar's. As Harmar's troops made their slow journey northward, they were closely watched by native scouts. Despite the natives scattering for their winter hunt, Shawnee War Chief Blue Jacket and Miami Chief Little Turtle quickly gathered around 600 men to confront Harmar's much larger force. Rather than engage directly, they chose to evacuate their non-combatants and waited for an opportune moment to attack. Upon reaching Kekionga on October 15th, Harmar's forward group, led by John Hardin, spent a few days raiding, burning native towns and destroying crops. A few days later, around 150 Shawnee and Potawatomi warriors ambushed Hardin's recon team, leading to a sharp defeat for the Americans. More reinforcements soon bolstered the native forces. By October 21st, Harmar believed his main goal was reached with the destruction of 5 Miami towns and 20,000 bushels of corn, and decided to head back. However, he allowed a 400-man detachment to go back to Kekionga for a surprise attack. This effort failed miserably when they were ambushed by the natives, barely managing a retreat. Despite contemplating another attack on Harmar's retreating forces, the natives called it off due to a lunar eclipse, which they took as a bad sign. After the conflict, Blue Jackets sought help from the British in Detroit, hoping to resist another American intrusion. However, the British decided to stay neutral, signaling a shift in their stance towards the Native Americans in the Northwest Territory. Harmar's campaign was seen as a disaster, leading to 183 American casualties. The Miamis also suffered significant losses. This defeat marked the end of Harmar's military career and was considered a national embarrassment, with calls for a more effective response to renew efforts for peace. Secretary Knox summed up the sentiments by stating the expedition's failure did not encourage peace, but instead might spur further hostility, signifying the need for another, more impactful expedition. After Harmar's military effort, Native American communities reconstructed their homes around Kekionga, with some moving to new areas. Although it was uncommon for Native Americans to engage in warfare during the winter, they pursued their advantage over Harmar by raiding American settlements north of the Ohio River. On the 2nd of January 1791, Wyandots and Lenapes launched an attack on Big Bottom along the Muskingum River, resulting in the deaths of 11 settlers. Not long after, Shawnees and Wyandots under Blue Jackets' leadership attempted, but failed to besiege Dunlap Station on the Great Miami River. At both sites, they left behind a war club, a traditional way of declaring war. While these attacks had mixed results, Sword, in 1985, points out they significantly altered the course of frontier history, highlighting that American expansion north of the Ohio River was not feasible without defeating the Native Americans first. More attacks by Native Americans occurred over the following months. Following the setback faced by Harmar in March 1791, Congress decided to increase the U.S. Army to 2 regiments. President Washington chose Arthur St. Clair, the governor of the Northwest Territory, to lead as Major General. St. Clair's orders were to conduct another punitive expedition to the Maumee River and establish a fort there as a strategy to intimidate and restrain the Native Americans in that region. St. Clair was also given the green light to incorporate mounted militia groups alongside the regular army, aiming to raid native villages and prevent further attacks on American settlements. Back in May 1791, as St. Clair was preparing his army, he sent Brigadier General Charles Scott and his 750 Kentucky militiamen on a raid. The local Native American groups rallied nearly 2,000 warriors, ready to confront Scott at Kekionga. However, Scott had other plans and headed northwest instead, attacking the Wee towns along the Wabash River like Uyatanon and Kethtipikanunk, places better known as Tippecanoe. St. Clair had aimed to kick off his campaign by July, yet was held back due to getting sick and trouble gathering enough recruits. In August, he ordered Lieutenant Colonel James Wilkinson to lead a second raid, initially planned as a mere distraction. With 500 Kentucky militia on horseback, Wilkinson razed a Miami town by the Eel River. During the attack, they killed 9 Way and Miami people, capturing 34, including the daughter of the Miami chief Little Turtle. This raid stirred the Confederation's leaders, who had been on the brink of offering peace, to prepare for war instead, making the raid's outcome the exact opposite of what Wilkinson had intended. By September, St. Clair's forces were constructing a supply base, Fort Hamilton, quite a way north of Fort Washington on the Great Miami River. On October 4th, St. Clair's troops, numbering about 2,300, finally marched out from Fort Hamilton. Mid-October saw them halting to build another supply station, Fort Jefferson, as they trudged towards Kekionga. Hindered by food shortages, morale hitting rock bottom, and soldiers deserting, the mission was in dire straits. On October 31st, St. Clair dispatched his 1st Infantry Regiment to handle the deserters, which cost him 300 of his best soldiers, and reduced his force to around 1,400, including non-fighters. On the morning of November 4th, as St. Clair's army camped by the Wabash River, near present-day Fort Recovery, Ohio, they were taken by surprise. Over 1,000 native warriors led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket attacked, especially targeting the militia on the river's north side. This caused chaos, with the native fighters using guerrilla tactics that targeted officers and artillerymen, making it hard for the American forces to mount a defense. In an attempt to break the encirclement, Lieutenant Colonel William Dark ordered a bayonet charge, which momentarily opened a gap. However, after 3 hours of intense fighting, St. Clair ordered a retreat, leaving behind the wounded and most of their gear. Major General Richard Butler, one of St. Clair's key officers, was among those left behind and was killed post-battle. Fort Jefferson, being too small, couldn't shelter the retreating troops, who had no choice but to run back to Fort Washington. This fight turned into a monumental victory for the Native American forces, marking it as one of their greatest wins and a catastrophic loss for the United States, as pointed out by historian Colin Calloway. The American side reported about 630 soldiers killed and another 250 wounded, plus the loss of around 30 camp followers, most of whom were women. In comparison, Native American casualties were minimal. After the battle, the Native American groups, low on food after their lands were ravaged, scattered to hunt before winter. Leaders like Little Turtle and Blue Jacket decided to leave Kekionga, seen as too exposed to American attack, for a new location at the Maumee and Auglaize rivers joining. This move, supported by the British, placed them nearer to British aid from Detroit. This new settlement, dubbed the Glades, became the Native Confederacy's stronghold for the rest of the war. Following the disastrous defeat led by St. Clair, the United States Congress decided to investigate the calamity. Despite the defeat, St. Clair kept his role as the territorial governor, but was pressured to step down from his military duties. President Washington knew something had to change, so he pushed Congress to form an army strong enough to take on the British-supported Northwestern Confederacy and protect the nation. By March 1792, a law was passed to expand the army to over 5,000 soldiers, and Mad Anthony Wayne was appointed as the new military chief. Additionally, Congress enacted 2 laws granting the president the power to mobilize the state-run militia. As the U.S. geared up militarily, Washington and his Secretary of War, Knox, sought diplomatic routes to delay conflict and calm those in the U.S. who were against going to war. In a significant diplomatic move, 50 Iroquois leaders were invited to Philadelphia in March 1792 to discuss peace terms they would later share at a council with the Northwestern Confederacy. The U.S. also attempted to reach out directly to the Northwestern Confederacy, a task complicated by the fact that American forces still occupied forts in disputed territories. Meanwhile, to enhance military communications and logistics, Fort St. Clair was built by Wilkinson in March 1792. However, peace efforts were set back when 2 U.S. emissaries were killed during their mission to negotiate peace, and in June, an attack on Fort Jefferson resulted in the death and capture of 15 U.S. soldiers. Amidst these tensions, Kentucky joined the Union as its own state. In response to these violent interactions, Rufus Putnam, known for founding Marietta, was made a brigadier general and assigned the task of negotiating peace with the Northwestern Confederacy. Disturbed by the deaths of prior negotiators, Putnam opted to negotiate with tribes along the lower Wabash River in Vincennes, leading to a treaty in September 1792. Knox thought this treaty would significantly weaken the Confederacy by reducing their numbers by 800 warriors, but it turned out the tribes involved weren't key militant factions within the Confederacy. Ultimately, the U.S. Senate didn't ratify the treaty, objecting to its failure to affirm that only the United States could purchase native lands. In late September of 1792, a significant gathering took place at the Glades, involving representatives from many Native American tribes with a robust turnout of around 3,600 warriors. This council saw delegates from the Iroquois, among them Red Jacket, who brought forth a peace proposition from the United States. Red Jacket suggested that the tribes should accept the Muskingum River as the border between native lands and the United States. However, speaking for the Confederacy, the Shawnee orator Red Pole criticized the Iroquois for their private negotiations with the Americans regarding land. Red Pole firmly stated, "We do not want compensation from the Americans. We want restitution of our country." After considerable discussion, the council aligned with Red Pole's stance, asserting that the Ohio River should be the rightful boundary, and called for the destruction of American forts north of this river. The group decided to engage in talks with the Americans in 1793. When Red Jacket relayed the council's decisions to an American official in November, he left out the crucial aspects concerning the Ohio River boundary and the demolition of forts. Consequently, the Americans were misled to believe that the Native Confederacy was ready to agree to their terms. This misunderstanding led Knox to commit to sending treaty commissioners to the 1793 meeting and to pause all military actions until then, much to the frustration of General Wayne, who had plans for an offensive in 1793. After the Glades Conference, Red Pole embarked on a significant journey to the south, aiming, though unsuccessfully, to rally more support from the Chickamauga Cherokees and Creeks for the Confederacy. Meanwhile, on November 6th, Little Turtle, alongside approximately 200 Miamis and Shawnees, launched an attack on a supply convoy near Fort St. Clair, resulting in the loss of 6 Americans and the critical supply of pack horses for the forts. In response to these events, Wayne expressed to Knox his frustration at being restrained from action, while the enemy freely took the offensive, calling it a most disagreeable and humiliating position. While General Wayne was waiting to see how peace talks would play out, he was also busy getting his Legion of the United States ready for battle. They camped at Legionville near Pittsburgh, right by the Ohio River. Wayne was convinced that the failures of previous expeditions were due to a lack of discipline. To fix this, he rigorously trained his troops, using harsh punishments for those who stepped out of line, including flogging for minor wrongdoings and even hanging deserters. As of May 5, 1793, the Legion had moved to a new camp close to Fort Washington, where Wayne was ready to launch an invasion as soon as he got the word. In mid-May, an important meeting was in the works. U.S. Commissioners Benjamin Lincoln, Beverly Randolph, and Timothy Pickering, tasked with negotiating with the Native Confederacy, made their way to Fort Niagara, located at the western end of Lake Ontario. They took a route through the Great Lakes to avoid the tragic ends met by John Hardin and Alexander Truman the year before. Interestingly, Fort Niagara was still under British control, a defiance of the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783. However, John Graves Simcoe, the British Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, welcomed the American commissioners into his own home. Despite this display of hospitality, Simcoe was not exactly a friend to the American cause. He had been actively working against U.S. interests among the native communities. Following native victories, Simcoe harbored hopes that Great Britain would back the creation of a native buffer state to act as a barrier between the United States and Canada, a plan the Americans did not agree with. The situation became more complicated with the outbreak of war in Europe between France and Great Britain in 1793. Simcoe found himself in a tight spot, needing to keep the peace with the United States to avoid opening another battlefront with France, all while trying to keep the British influence alive among the native populations. During their stay at Niagara, the U.S. commissioners were approached by a native delegation led by Brant. Brant, who had been instrumental in organizing the Northwestern Confederacy, was now viewed with suspicion by its more militant members due to his openness to negotiate with Americans and because the Iroquois had stayed out of the conflict. Despite the mistrust, Brant represented the delegation, questioning the commissioners about their authority to establish a new boundary line and expressing concern about Wayne's troops preparing for battle amidst ongoing peace talks. The commissioners reassured Brant that they had the authority to negotiate a border and that fighting had been officially paused. Brant relayed this information back to the Confederacy in Maumee, but despite rallying some support, he faced criticism for not demanding the Ohio River as the boundary line. Consequently, a new delegation, this time without Brant, set out to meet the commissioners on the Detroit River. In late July at Matthew Elliott's estate near Amherstburg, a significant meeting took place. Hosted on July 30th, it featured voices from the Native American Confederacy, including the Wyandot chief Carry One About, also known as Sowagda-Wunk, and other leaders like Buckongahelas from the Lenape and Kekwepilethi. Their message was firm. The Ohio River should serve as the boundary between their lands and the American settlers, who they insisted must withdraw from territories north of the river. The American representatives countered, explaining those lands were already sold and settled, making it impossible to return them. This standoff led the native delegates to retreat to the Maumee for further discussions. There, despite Joseph Brant's push for compromise, the more militant voices prevailed, backed by Alexander McKee. By August 13th, the Confederacy formally relayed their position to the United States Commissioners. All the represented nations, barring the Iroquois, signed a declaration. Historian Sugden described this document as embodying the bold and unwavering stance of proud, undefeated peoples, emphasizing their independence and challenging the Americans. They proposed the United States should divert funds allocated for land acquisition and warfare to relocate settlers south of the Ohio River instead. The American commissioners, finding this proposal unacceptable, declared the negotiations over. Brant relayed to the Maumee Assembly that the Iroquois could no longer support the Confederacy's military efforts and would distance themselves from the Americans. When word reached him that talks had faltered, General Anthony Wayne advanced with 2,600 men, arriving at Fort Jefferson by mid-October. Soon after, on October 17th, an attack by an Ottawa war party led by Little Otter targeted an American supply convoy, resulting in casualties and captures. This attack prompted Wayne to strengthen his supply lines with more troops and pause his campaign to build Fort Greenville north of Fort Jefferson. Confused about Native American strategies, Wayne wrote of his uncertainty to Knox in November. Meanwhile, the native forces faced their own challenges, dispersing for winter hunts. That winter, Wayne's legions stationed themselves at Fort Greenville. Yet on December 23rd, Wayne took about 300 men to revisit the site of St. Clair's previous defeat. There they established Fort Recovery, paid respects to the fallen Americans by burying them, and managed to reclaim 3 cannons lost during the Battle of 1791. In January of 1794, a group representing the Native Confederacy went to Fort Greenville to negotiate the release of 2 Lenape women held captive by the Americans. During this meeting, a Lenape chief inquired whether Wayne, the American commander, was open to peace talks. Wayne's condition for negotiations was clear. He would engage in discussions only if the Native American war parties were called back, and all American captives were set free within the next 30 days. Upon returning to their base at the Glades, the Confederacy leaders who favored a more aggressive stance were taken aback to find out that peace talks had been proposed without their consent. They debated Wayne's proposal but decided against pursuing the peace talks. Come February 1794, during a meeting in Quebec with an Iroquois delegation, Lord Dorchester of Great Britain hinted at a possible war with the United States within the year. He also mentioned the possibility of restoring the native lands that had been taken by the Americans. Following this, Dorchester directed Simcoe to construct a fort along the Maumee River to help protect Detroit from American forces. By April, Simcoe had Fort Miami up and running with 120 soldiers and artillery in place. This move by the British, especially the construction of Fort Miami on land the United States considered its own, stirred significant tensions. The United States saw it as an outright aggressive act. As a response to the escalating crisis, in May, Chief Justice John Jay was sent to England in hopes of finding a peaceful solution. Meanwhile, the Native Confederacy, feeling emboldened by Britain's stance and actions, began sending out messengers to gather more warriors to their cause. At Fort Greenville, issues with supplies were slowing things down, but the construction of Fort Miami pushed Wayne to speed things up. He was really looking forward to getting started and was waiting eagerly for extra soldiers from Kentucky to join him. By the end of June, Wayne had the support of around 100 Chickasaws and Choctaws who had traveled from the south eager to battle their longtime rivals in the Northwestern Confederacy. On June 27th, a small team of 45 Choctaws and 10 scouts, led by Wayne's top scout William Wells, clashed with a large group of Native Americans pushing forward from the Glaze area. Wells let Wayne know that Fort Recovery was about to be attacked. The Native American forces headed towards Fort Recovery were impressive, numbering at 1,200 warriors, the biggest army the Confederacy had ever put together. This group didn't have a single leader calling the shot. Instead, they made military decisions through a council made up of top chiefs and warriors. Blue Jacket, one of the leaders, suggested they should skip attacking Fort's recovery in Greenville and instead hit the American supply lines hard to cut off Wayne's legion. However, leaders from the Three Fires, who had just arrived and whose fighters made up most of the army, thought it was better to attack a supply convoy near Fort Recovery. Their plan won out, and on June 30th, the warriors launched a surprise attack on the convoy and then tried to take Fort Recovery, but they were pushed back by the American forces using guns and cannons. This defeat really demoralized the Three Fires group, who felt let down by the Shawnees for not supporting enough. Disappointed, they headed back home, leaving Blue Jacket without about half of his forces, which went back to the Glaze area. Following this setback, leaders Little Turtle and Tarhi of the Wyandot people went to Detroit to seek help from the British, as Blue Jacket had tried before. However, the British commander, Lieutenant Colonel Richard G. England, told them he couldn't engage in battle with the Americans without direct orders. On the morning of August 20th, the Legion, now reduced to about 3,000 soldiers and militia after spreading forces to defend supply lines and forts, marched toward the Maumee River near what is now Toledo, Ohio. Here, Blue Jacket had prepared an ambush, choosing a battlefield already disrupted by a tornado, which knocked down hundreds of trees, providing natural cover. He positioned his forces, some 1,500 strong, including Shawnees, Delawares, Miamis, Wyandots, Mingos, a few Mohawks, and a British unit disguised as Native Americans. The battle started when Odawa and Potawatomi warriors, led by Little Otter and Egushawa, attacked the Legion's scouts. The Legion initially struggled, but General Wayne quickly sent in reserves and broke his infantry into two groups to stabilize the situation. His strategy also involved securing positions with cavalry and a brigade of militia. Upon discovering the enemy's position, Wayne's men launched a bayonet charge, supported by a cavalry attack. Facing this onslaught, Blue Jacket's forces retreated to Fort Miami, only to find it closed off by the British, who were at this point looking to improve relations with the United States amidst the French Revolution. The fight was over in just over an hour, leaving both sides with casualties, but marking a decisive moment of mistrust among the native nations, their confederacy, and the British allies, effectively ending large-scale native military resistance in the region. After the battle, Wayne's troops stayed near Fort Miami, making a point to the British there without direct confrontation. Wayne even inspected the fort's walls up close, challenging the British garrison's patience. Following this, Wayne's forces went on to destroy native villages and supplies in a show of force before heading to Kekionga. On September 17th, Wayne chose a site in Kekionga for a new fort, aiming for a stronghold capable of resisting Native American forces and British artillery from Fort Detroit. Completed by October 17th, Fort Wayne was built strong enough to withstand serious firepower and was dedicated on October 22nd, marking the establishment of what is today Fort Wayne, Indiana. Wayne also bolstered his defensive network with several other forts, ensuring a lasting U.S. military presence in the region. A few months after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the United States and Great Britain sat down and hammered out the Jay Treaty. This was a significant event because it required the British to vacate their forts around the Great Lakes. Additionally, it opened up new trade opportunities for Americans in some British-controlled Caribbean territories. The treaty established the principles of free trade and permitted Native Americans to move freely between lands governed by either the United States or Great Britain. The United States Senate approved it in 1795. General Wayne cited this treaty as evidence that the British would not support the Native American Confederacy anymore. The Jay Treaty ignited considerable political debates, especially during the 1796 presidential election where John Adams, who supported the treaty, won against Thomas Jefferson, who was not in favor of it. In the same year, the United States also finalized the Treaty of Greenville. Following a challenging defeat and then a minor comeback at Fort Recovery, this treaty established a boundary requiring the Native American tribes in the Northwest to relinquish lands in southern and eastern Ohio, along with certain areas around forts and settlements in what was known as the Illinois country. It clarified that the U.S., not Britain, had authority in the Old Northwest. Additionally, it forced the Miami tribe to relinquish control over the strategic Kekionga portage. This was a crucial point because the Northwest Ordinance, a series of regulations passed by Congress, had already decreed that significant portages should be accessible to everyone. In 1796, under the Jay Treaty, the British left behind Fort Lernoult and Fort Miami. The very next day, United States troops led by Colonel Hamtramck took over Fort Lernoult. They then changed its name to Fort Detroit, but gave up on Fort Miami in 1799. However, during the War of 1812, the British managed to take back both Fort Detroit and Fort Miami. Fort Detroit was soon left by the British as American forces closed in a year later, and Fort Miami was abandoned in 1814, eventually being torn down. Additionally, by 1796, the United States had walked away from most of its forts in the West. The exception was Fort Washington, which in 1804 was relocated across the Ohio River to Kentucky due to the expansion of Cincinnati. This new location became known as the Newport Barracks. General Wayne, who had played a critical role in the surrender of British forts in the Northwest Territory, chose the spot for Fort Wayne in Kekyonga to mark his legion's triumph. General Wayne died on his way back to Pennsylvania from Detroit on December 15, 1796, a year after the Treaty of Greenville was signed. His second-in-command, General Wilkinson, took over. But it was later discovered Wilkinson had been working against Wayne, sending negatively toned letters about him to politicians and newspapers, all while secretly working for Spain. There were rumors, though unconfirmed, that Wilkinson may have been behind Wayne's mysterious death. After the conflicts ended, a large wave of settlers moved into the Northwest Territory. Some entered into questionable land deals with native nations, leading General Wilkinson to cancel those deals in 1796 via a proclamation. Following the Treaty of Greenville 5 years earlier, Ohio was carved out from the Northwest Territory, aligning with the established forts and the treaty line. Everything west of this line became known as Indiana Territory. By February 1803, Ohio joined the Union as a state. Thomas Jefferson, the third President of the United States, had a vision of bringing Native Americans into American society through assimilation and intermarriage. However, he supported policies that forced them off their lands and into debt, with the belief that this would make Native leaders more pliable. William Henry Harrison, the territorial governor, took a hard stance on seizing Native American lands. The arrival of new settlers brought with them diseases, debt, and instances of drunkenness and sexual abuse that afflicted native populations. In 1805, a traditionalist movement led by Tenskwatawa emerged, pushing back against U.S. practices. This movement established Prophetstown in the Indiana Territory, setting the stage for Tecumseh's War and the involvement in the War of 1812's Northwest Theater. The push for U.S. settlement didn't slow down, leading to further Indian removals and conflicts in the Northwest Territory into the 1830s. Notable conflicts include the Black Hawk War and the Potawatomi Trail of Death. Wisconsin became the last state from the Northwest Territory to join the Union in 1848. This era of land acquisition and sale to white settlers was key to reducing the national debt of the United States during the 1830s. Before he passed away, Little Turtle pointed out the devastating impact of peace terms, saying, "More of us have died since the Treaty of Greenville than we lost by the years of war before." Academic contributors to the Journal of Genocide Research have labeled the U.S. actions in the Northwest Territory as a form of attempted genocide, drawing on Secretary of War Henry Knox's negative descriptions of native groups and his orders to eliminate them. These scholars argue that the end goal was to clear the area of Native Americans for white settlers. In the aftermath, no future Native American resistance could match the scale or power of the Northwestern Confederacy. Wiley Sword, an author, noted that the Indian Wars of the 19th century overshadowed earlier conflicts which actually sealed their fate, especially those in the 1790s that have been largely overlooked by American historians seeking to maintain a patriotic narrative. This war lacks a commonly recognized name or starting date. According to Hoagland in 2017, this conflict, which marked the formation of the U.S. Army, went unnamed. In historical records, it has been referred to in various ways, including the Northwest Indian Wars, Ohio, from 1790 to 1795, the Northwest Indian War, Indiana, noting the 1811 Battle of Tippecanoe, Little Turtle's War, the United States Indian War of 1790 to 1795, and suggestions of Miami Confederacy War, or Ohio Indian War of 1790-1795. It underscores the complexity and variety of perspectives on this period. Moreover, the Northwest Indian War is significant as one of the earliest campaigns listed in United States Army lineages, marked by the Indian Wars campaign streamer. Particularly notable as nearly all active duty units were disbanded post-American Revolution, save for one field artillery company. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.